We were celebrating my daughter's engagement at the nicest restaurant in Portland when her fiancé excused himself to take a phone call, and the woman at the table behind us leaned forward and slipped a folded cocktail napkin into my hand. She was maybe 70, silver hair pinned back neatly, the kind of woman who reminded you of a retired school teacher. Her eyes were steady and serious, and she said only 4 words before she turned away. Don't let her sign. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know that my daughter had already handed this man more than her heart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want you to know that some details in this story have been adjusted for privacy and for storytelling clarity, but the heart of it, the warning, the danger, and what we almost lost, that's as real as anything I've ever lived through. My name is Cliff, and I spent 31 years as a family law attorney in Portland, Oregon. I retired at 63, not because I was tired of the work, but because my wife Lorraine was sick, and I wanted every hour I had left with her. She passed 14 months later. Pancreatic cancer. We had been married 38 years. My daughter is the only child we had. Her name is Noelle, and she got her mother's laugh and her mother's stubbornness in equal measure. She works as a hospital pharmacist, responsible, careful with details in a way that her job demands. After Lorraine passed, the two of us leaned on each other in a way we never had before. She called every Sunday without fail. She drove down from her apartment in Vancouver, Washington, just to have dinner with me on the holidays. She was, in every way that mattered, the center of what remained of my family. She met him the summer after her mother died. His name was Cole Whitfield, and he was introduced to her at a colleague's birthday gathering as a commercial real estate developer based out of Seattle. He was 44, fit, well-dressed, the kind of man who remembered small details about you from one conversation to the next. What you ordered, what made you laugh, what you were worried about. Noelle called me after their second date and said, "Dad, I think this might actually be something." I had handled enough divorce cases to know that charm was not the same as character. But I also knew that my daughter was 36 years old, that she had been lonely since her mother died, and that my job was not to be a wall between her and her own life. So I said, "I hope so, sweetheart. I really do." They dated for 8 months. By month 4, he had moved into her apartment. By month 6, he had suggested they consolidate some of their finances to simplify things. By month 7, Noelle mentioned almost casually over the phone that Cole had been helping her update her estate paperwork, said they should have things in order if they were going to build a future together. He had a lawyer he trusted, she said, a friend from college. It was all very routine. Something moved in my chest when she said that. Not quite alarm, more like the feeling you get when you notice a hairline crack in a wall you recently painted. Small, easy to dismiss, but you saw it. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being overprotective, that I was projecting the worst patterns from 30 years of contested estates and broken marriages onto my daughter's new relationship. Cole had been nothing but courteous to me. He remembered to ask about my old setter, Winston, who had arthritis. He drove Noelle to my house on her birthday so we could all have dinner together. He poured me a second glass of wine without being asked. I convinced myself the crack was nothing. The engagement dinner was held at a restaurant called Harborside in downtown Portland. Cole had arranged it, private room, candles, the kind of menu where the prices aren't listed because the assumption is that if you need to ask, you shouldn't be there. He proposed to Noelle 2 nights earlier at Cannon Beach, and she had called me so happy she was breathless. I cried in my kitchen after I hung up, not from sadness exactly, but from the particular grief of having no one to share the moment with. Lorraine should have been there. She would have cried, too. At the dinner, it was Noelle Cole, his sister who had driven up from Salem, and a couple of Noelle's friends from the hospital. I sat across from Cole, and I watched him the way I used to watch opposing counsel in a deposition, not looking for anything in particular, just watching. He got a call about 40 minutes into the meal. He glanced at his phone, said something about a development deal in Tacoma that had hit a snag, and excused himself with the kind of smooth apology that suggested he had made it before. And I waved him off good-naturedly, and that's when the woman at the table behind me leaned forward. "Don't let her sign." Then she turned back to her meal as if nothing had happened. I held the cocktail napkin in my lap. Noelle was laughing at something one of her friends had said. Cole's sister was checking her phone. Nobody had seen the exchange. I unfolded the napkin under the table. There was a name written on it in blue ink, small and careful. Beneath the name, a phone number. And below that, 3 words. "She's not the first." When Cole came back to the table, he was all warmth and apology, hand on Noel's shoulder, easy smile. I watched his face and I kept my own face very still. 31 years of depositions had taught me how to do that. He glanced at me once, the way people do when they sense they're being observed, and I nodded and lifted my wine glass. I left the restaurant early, said I was tired, which wasn't entirely untrue. I hugged Noelle at the door and held on a beat longer than usual. She pulled back and looked at me with that slight furrow between her brows that she'd had since she was a little girl. "You okay, Dad? I'm proud of you," I said. Which was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. In the car, I looked at the napkin again. The name was Vivian Carroll. I didn't sleep that night. I called the number the next morning. It rang 4 times. I had already started to compose a message in my head when a woman picked up. Her voice was quiet and careful, the voice of someone who had learned to be careful. She said she had seen Noelle's engagement announcement on a mutual friend's social media. She said she had driven to Portland specifically because she needed to speak with someone from Noelle's family. She said she had been married to Cole Whitfield 3 years earlier. "Married," I said. "For 11 months," she said. Then she told me the rest. "We met that afternoon at a coffee shop in Northeast Portland. Nothing fancy, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and too many plants." Vivienne was in her early 50s, composed in the way that people become composed after something has broken them and they've rebuilt themselves slowly. She wore a brace on her left wrist. She said it was from a car accident. She set a folder on the table between us without preamble. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to understand that I can prove all of it." She had met Cole at a charity gala in Seattle. He was attentive, thoughtful, the kind of man who made you feel like the most important person in the room. They were engaged within 6 months. She owned a home in Bellevue that she had inherited from her parents, along with a brokerage account and a life insurance policy, with a face value of just over $800,000. She was also, at the time, the named beneficiary on her mother's estate, which was still in probate. Cole had connected her with an estate attorney he knew, a man named Stanton Pruitt, who operated out of a suite in the Columbia Center. The paperwork was comprehensive, he had explained. Now that they were combining their lives, it made sense to consolidate beneficiaries, update ownership documents, review the insurance policies. Routine, he had said. His word. I signed everything he put in front of me, Vivienne said. I trusted him. I was happy. Happy people don't read the fine print. She slid the folder across to me. I opened it. It took me less than 90 seconds to see what had been done. The beneficiary designations on her life insurance had been updated. The deed to the Bellevue house had been transferred into a joint trust, structured so that in the event of her death, full ownership transferred to Cole without probate. Power of attorney had been assigned to Cole for the duration of any incapacitation. Every document bore her signature. Every signature had been notarized by Stanton Pruitt. 4 months after our wedding, Vivian said, I was driving home from my sister's house on a night when it was raining. My brake line had been cut. Not cleanly, the way you see in movies. Slowly, so it would fail gradually. I hit a guardrail on Highway 520 going about 40 miles an hour. I was lucky. The car didn't go over. I walked away with a concussion, a broken wrist, and a cracked rib. She looked at her hands. Cole was at my bedside when I woke up. He was devastated. He held my hand. He cried. She paused. I believed him for 3 more months, until I found the second set of documents. She'd been clearing out a filing cabinet in the home office they shared when she found a folder tucked beneath a false bottom. Inside were printed emails between Cole and Pruitt. Timelines, projected insurance payouts, a note in Cole's handwriting that said simply, accelerate after 6 months if no natural opportunity. She had photographed everything before Cole came home. She had driven directly to her sister's house and not returned. The divorce was handled through her attorney with a restraining order in place. Cole had contested it, but without his documentation, which she had taken, his position was weak. He eventually signed. He walked away with nothing, Vivian said, which made him furious, and it means he needs to try again. I sat back in my chair. Outside the window, Portland went about its Thursday afternoon. I thought about 31 years of family law, all the ways people destroyed each other over money and love and wounded pride. And I thought about Noelle standing at Canada Beach saying yes to a man who had already decided what she was worth. Has he tried again since you? I asked. Vivian opened to a second section of the folder. There was a woman in Olympia, Washington, a surgical nurse who had dated Cole for 5 months before something had alarmed her and she had ended it before marriage. There was a woman in Boise who had gotten engaged and then broken it off. She wasn't sure why. The story was incomplete. And there was a woman named Vivian paused, checked her notes. A woman in Spokane who had married Cole 8 months ago. My hands went still on the table. Married, I said. Her name is Phoebe Arnett. She's a physical therapist. She has a home, investments, and a life insurance policy through her hospital employer. Vivian's voice was measured. According to her last social media post, they went hiking in the Cascades 2 weeks ago. I drove home and sat in my living room for a long time. The house was quiet in the way that houses get after someone dies in them. Not haunted exactly, just aware. I had built Lorraine's reading chair into the corner by the window because she liked the afternoon light, and I still hadn't moved it. Winston slept under it now, the way he used to sleep at her feet. I looked at him and thought about what I was going to do. I had been a family law attorney for 3 decades. I knew exactly what a man like Cole was doing, and exactly how he was doing it. I also knew what happened when you went to law enforcement with a folder of circumstantial documents and a story that sounded like the plot of a thriller. I'd watched enough cases stall, enough clever men walk away, to know that knowledge and proof were not the same thing as justice. I needed more, and I needed to move before Noelle signed anything. I called her that evening. Normal conversation. I asked about her day, asked about the engagement, asked whether she and Cole had started talking about a date. She was radiant over the phone. The way she had been those last months before Lorraine went into hospice, before everything got heavy. I hated what I was holding. Cole mentioned that the two of you were going to go over some financial stuff soon, I said, keeping my voice easy. Updating things now that you're engaged. Yeah, he set up an appointment with his attorney next week, she said. It's just estate stuff. He's been really organized about all of it. What attorney? Someone named Pruitt. He has an office downtown. I kept my voice even. What day next week? Thursday afternoon. I had 6 days. The first thing I did was call a colleague of mine, a former DA named Russell Okafor, who had moved into private practice 15 years ago and now specialized in financial fraud. I met him the next morning at his office in the Pearl District and laid out everything Vivian had told me and showed him the documents. He read through them without speaking. When he finished, he folded his hands and looked at me over his reading glasses. Cliff, he said, this is a pattern. This is a documented repeating pattern with at least one attempt that resulted in serious bodily injury. I know what it is, I said. Then you know you can't just confront this man. You need to build the box before you put him in it. Russell called in a favor with a contact at the Washington State Attorney General's office. I called Vivian and asked if she was willing to speak with law enforcement. She said yes without hesitation. She had been waiting for someone to call her for 2 years. I then did something that required me to be still and careful, and to set aside every instinct that told me to go straight to my daughter with the truth. I called Cole. I told him I had been going through some of Lorraine's estate documents and had some questions about the trust structure. I said I knew he had a relationship with an estate attorney and wondered if he could recommend someone who could review things with me. I said I was getting older and Noelle was my only heir and I wanted things to be in order. He was warm, immediately, effortlessly. Said of course. Said Peru was excellent. Said he would set something up. Said it was good that I was thinking ahead. Said he was forward to having me as family. I thanked him and got off the phone and sat very still for a moment. Then I called Russell back and told him to move faster. Russell's contact at the AG's office turned out to have an open investigation file on Stanton Pruitt that was thin but real. 2 complaints from clients in King County, a flag on a document filing that had been reviewed and set aside for insufficient evidence. When Russell's contact heard Vivian's name, there was a pause on the line. Then the contact said, "We've been looking for her for 8 months. She's the key to the Pruitt file." Things moved faster after that. What I did not expect was what happened on the Tuesday before Noelle's appointment. 2 days out. I was at my kitchen table going through the documents Russell had asked me to compile when my phone rang. Unknown number, Oregon area code. I picked up. The voice on the other end was a man's, older, unhurried. He said his name was Bernard Coate. He said he had seen the engagement announcement in a local publication. Cole had submitted it to a Portland neighborhood magazine, the kind of thing that still ran social items. And he said he had been trying to reach someone from Noelle's family for 3 weeks. I knew Cole Whitfield's father, Bernard said. Knew him well for a time. And I know what that boy became. Bernard drove down from Astoria the next morning. He was 78 years old, still sharp, a retired maritime insurance broker, with the kind of precise memory that comes from a lifetime of assessing risk. He had known Cole's father through a professional association, had watched the family from a distance over the years, and had seen Cole's name come up in connection with something that had troubled him deeply. He had a friend, he said, a woman named Eunice, who had worked as a paralegal at a law office in Seattle for 20 years before retiring. She had processed documents for Stanton Pruitt on two separate occasions through a co-counsel arrangement, and she had been uncomfortable enough with what she saw to keep copies. Bernard set a manila envelope on my kitchen table. Inside were copies of trust documents, insurance transfer forms, and a series of emails from an address he identified as belonging to Pruitt, discussing the mechanics of what he called the inheritance acceleration timeline. The emails referenced a client only as CW. Eunice kept these because she was afraid, Bernard said. She didn't know who to give them to. She gave them to me because she trusted me. I've been waiting for the right person to find me. I looked at him across my kitchen table. Winston had come over and put his head on Bernard's knee the way he used to do with people he decided were safe. You drove 3 hours to bring me this, I said. I have a granddaughter, Bernard said simply, about the same age as yours. On Wednesday night, I sat in my living room with Russell's file, Bernard's envelope, Vivienne's folder, and the transcript of a recorded call that Russell's contact had authorized as part of the AG's investigation. The call was between Pruitt and a voice that audio analysis later confirmed as Cole Whitfield, discussing the timeline for Noel's documentation and the projected asset transfer value. The number they discussed was $940,000. Noelle had her mother's house, which she had inherited and which had appreciated significantly. She had her hospital retirement accounts. She had a life insurance policy through her employer with the benefit her department had increased 2 years ago when she took on a senior pharmacist role. She had Lorraine's jewelry, which I had never told her was appraised at just over $90,000 and which I had insured accordingly. Cole Whitfield had added it all up before he said I love you for the first time. I called Noelle that night, not to tell her everything. Not yet, just to hear her voice. She talked about the wedding for 20 minutes, about venues and flowers and whether she wanted an outdoor ceremony. She sounded like herself, fully, entirely herself, and I held on to that. Before I got off the phone, I said, Noelle, I know you have that appointment tomorrow with the attorney. Would you do me a favor and wait until Friday? I have some documents I want to bring with me when you go. Estate stuff from your mother. I think you should have reviewed it at the same time. There was a brief pause. Dad, it's really routine stuff. Cole says it won't take long. I know, I said. Humor an old man. 1 extra day. Another pause. Then, okay, I'll text Cole. I exhaled so slowly I didn't realize I was doing it until Winston looked up at me from the floor. The following morning, Russell called me at 7:45. The AG's office is moving today, he said. They have enough for a warrant on Pruitt. They're going to want everything you have. They can have it. There's more, Russell said. The Spokane situation. Phoebe Arnett, her attorney, contacted the AG's office this morning. She's been trying to figure out how to get out safely. When the investigator told her what they had, she broke down on the phone. Cole's timeline with Phoebe was already in motion. She had signed the initial documents. The insurance beneficiary had been changed. The only thing that hadn't happened yet was whatever he was planning next. She's safe? I asked. Investigators are with her now. She's been moved to her sister's house. Cole doesn't know yet. I drove to Noelle's apartment that afternoon. I had called ahead and said I needed to come by, that it was important, that I needed her to sit down with me for a while before she did anything else. She opened the door and looked in my face, and I watched her expression shift from curious to something more careful. We sat at her kitchen table. I had the folder with me. I had thought about how to do this for 4 days, and I still didn't have the right words, so I just started at the beginning. The woman at the restaurant. The cocktail napkin. Vivian Carroll. The break line. Stanton Pruitt and the documents. Bernard Coate and his friend Eunice. The recorded call. The number they had calculated her life was worth. Noelle listened without speaking. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her. About halfway through, she got up and poured herself a glass of water and stood at the sink for a moment with her back to me. Then she came back and sat down and said, "Keep going." When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Winston was at my feet. Outside, a neighbor's kid was riding a bike on the sidewalk. He asked me last week if I wanted to change my life insurance beneficiary, Noelle said. Her voice was steady in the way that voices get when the emotion is too large to hold. But you're holding it anyway. He said it made sense now that we were engaged. He said his attorney could take care of it at the Thursday appointment. I know, I said. She looked at the folder on the table. Then she looked at me. He cried when I said yes at the beach, she said. He actually cried. I didn't know what to say to that. I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. I know, I said again. Cole was taken into custody the next morning at his apartment in the Pearl District. Stanton Pruitt was arrested simultaneously at his office in Seattle. The warrants covered fraud, conspiracy, and in connection with Vivian's case, charges related to tampering with a vehicle with intent to cause serious injury. The Washington AG's office issued a statement that afternoon. By evening, 2 local news stations had picked up the story. Noelle's name was not in any of the coverage. The investigators had protected that. But she watched the news report sitting next to me on my couch. And when Cole's face appeared on the screen in the footage of him being walked to a patrol car, she made a sound I had never heard from her before. Not a cry exactly. More like the sound you make when you've been holding your breath without knowing it and you finally let it go. The days that followed were not easy. That part doesn't get talked about enough in stories like this. The aftermath. The way you move through regular life with something shattered inside you that other people can't see. Noelle took a week off work. She came and stayed with me for 4 days, sleeping in her old bedroom, taking Winston for long walks in the morning. She didn't want to talk about Cole most of the time, and I didn't push. When she did want to talk, I listened. She asked me once, on the second day, whether I had suspected him from the beginning. I had a feeling, I said carefully. But feelings aren't proof. And I didn't want to be the father who couldn't let his daughter be happy. She thought about that for a while. What made you take it seriously? A woman I didn't know handed me a napkin and told me not to let you sign. I paused, and I almost ignored it anyway. She looked at me. Why? Because you were happy, I said, and I wanted you to stay that way. I almost let that want override what I knew. She was quiet for a long time after that. What I want to say to you, if you stayed with me through all of this, is something I have turned over in my mind many times since that night at Harborside. I am a man who spent 31 years in family law. I had seen every variation of financial predation, manipulation, and fraud that one person can visit on another. I understood the mechanics of what Cole was doing almost immediately after Vivienne laid it out for me. And I still nearly convinced myself not to act. Not because I was foolish, because I loved my daughter, and I wanted to believe she was safe. That is the thing about manipulation. It doesn't prey on weakness. It preys on love. It preys on the specific hope that the person you care about has finally found what they were looking for. Cole Whitfield was counting on my wanting to believe in him because Noelle did. He was counting on the fact that a protective father is easier to manage than a suspicious one if you give him just enough warmth. He almost won. Vivian Carroll testified at the preliminary hearing. Bernard Coates submitted his documentation. Phoebe Arnett's attorney cooperated fully with the AG's investigation, and she was interviewed without her name being released to the press. Stanton Pruitt agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced charge arrangement. The case against Cole is pending trial. I spoke to Vivian twice more in the months that followed. She seemed lighter each time, the way people do when something they've been carrying is finally being held by the right hands. On our second call, she said something that stayed with me. She said, I was afraid no one would believe me because I looked like a woman who had married badly and was bitter about it. I was afraid the paperwork wouldn't be enough. I was afraid he would just do it again and I couldn't stop it. You did stop it, I told her. We did, she said. Noelle had Lorraine's ring resized and started wearing it on her right hand. She told me it made her feel like her mother was still with her. I told her mother always would be. Some evenings I sit in my living room with Winston asleep at my feet, and I think about that moment at the restaurant. The elderly woman with the silver hair leaning forward across the table behind me. The neatly folded cocktail napkin. The careful handwriting. I've thought about what would have happened if I had been in the restroom when she passed that napkin. If I had dismissed it as the eccentric gesture of a stranger. If I had tucked it into my pocket without reading it until the next day, after Noelle had already been charmed another inch closer to that Thursday appointment. I think about how thin it was. That margin. How ordinary the moment looked from the outside. I believe there are moments in a father's life when you are given one clear chance to protect your child, and everything depends on whether you're paying attention. Not suspicious, not paranoid, just paying attention. I had been a lawyer for 30 years and a father for 36. And in that moment, the two things came together in a way they never quite had before. Pay attention to the things that make you uncomfortable even when you can't explain why. Read the documents. Ask who benefits. And when a stranger hands you a warning on a cocktail napkin and says she's not the first, believe her. Because in my experience, by the time someone is warning you, the clock has already started. I still think about that cocktail napkin. How small it was. How easy it would have been to fold it back up and leave it on the table. Tell myself a stranger's scrawl was none of my business. I spent 31 years as a family law attorney, and I thought that meant I was harder to fool than most. But Cole Whitfield didn't try to fool me. He tried to make me feel comfortable. There's a difference, and it matters. He remembered my dog's name. He poured my wine. He called me family before he had earned the right to, and I let it work on me because I wanted it to, because Noelle was happy in a way she hadn't been since her mother got sick. And wanting that happiness to be real made me willing to overlook the quiet unease I carried every time I sat across from him at a table. That unease was the most honest thing in the room. I just wasn't listening to it. What I've come to understand since all of this ended is that the right thing and the easy thing almost never arrive together. The right thing that night at Harborside was to act on what I knew. The easy thing was to believe I was being a paranoid old man who had seen too much divorce to trust a good thing when his daughter found one. I nearly chose easy. I chose right by the thinnest margin, and I don't take any special credit for that. A woman I had never met, Vivian Carroll, had already done the harder work years before I ever had to. She survived a car accident that was meant to kill her. She rebuilt herself in a city where no one knew her name. She kept every document and she waited. That took a kind of courage I can only admire from a distance. Bernard drove 3 hours from Astoria because he had a granddaughter. That's the whole reason, not because it was his problem, not because anyone asked him to, but because he understood that staying quiet, when you know something, makes you part of what happens next. He made a choice that cost him a full day and probably some sleep, and that choice was part of the chain that kept my daughter safe. There's a thread running through all of it, through Vivian's patience and Bernard's drive down the coast, and Russell's careful work, and even Noelle's willingness to delay one appointment at her father's request. Every single person in this story made a small decision to act with integrity when it would have been easier not to. Cole and Pruitt made the opposite decision, over and over, for years. And the difference in where they ended up isn't complicated. It's just the accumulated weight of the choices they made. I think about what Noelle said when it was over, that Cole had cried when she said yes at the beach. She kept returning to that detail. I didn't tell her what I actually thought, which is that the most dangerous people are not the ones who don't feel anything. They're the ones who know exactly which feeling to perform and when. Knowing the difference requires you to watch the pattern over time, not just the moment in front of you. I should have watched the pattern earlier. I know that. What I try to carry forward is simpler than it sounds. Pay attention, not suspiciously, not fearfully, just honestly. Read the documents. Ask who benefits. Trust the feeling that something is moving faster than it should. And when someone takes a risk to warn you, take the risk of believing them. Noelle wears her mother's ring on her right hand now. She's doing well. And every time I look at Winston asleep under that chair in the corner, I think about how close it came to being a very different story.